Hello, and welcome again to Edgemont AMA. I'm Pastor Henry Prater. We are so glad that you have found us and are going to spend a little time with us as we take a little bit to have responses to questions that have been asked. And we're going to move into a series. It might be two, probably going to be more like 3 or 4, talking about this, our Bible. Where did it come from? How did it end up like it is today? What are some of the versions that we should use? Maybe what are some of the differences between the Bible we use as a United Methodist congregation, a Protestant congregation, and maybe our Catholic brothers and sisters? Well, those are going to be some of the things that we talk about. As you notice, I've moved locations. I'm over at the parsonage for this round of videos. I hope you'll enjoy that. And I should also give the caveat, you are probably going to hear dogs barking because it is a beautiful day. People are out and about, and our dogs feel like that they need to let us know every time something gets remotely close to us, whether that's a car, a person, a squirrel, a beetle, a leaf. You know how it is. So that'll be some of the noise. So, talking about our Bible, where did it come from? How did we get it? We have to talk a little bit about what the Bible is. So the Bible is a book. Yes, the Bible is a book. But the Bible is more than just a book, because the Bible is really a collection of books, an anthology. It's a book that has writings of various different genres. You know, we get history when you look at things like 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. We have poetry and worship that you find in the Psalms or Song of Solomon. We've got stories that are kind of history, but also have a little bit of elements of legend and storytelling to them that we find in Job and Esther. We've got the writings of the prophets. We have the Pentateuch, the writing of Moses, and the collection of explaining how the people of Israel came into being. We've got all that in the New Testament. We've got the Gospels, which are historical, persuasive biographies. We've got the book of Acts, which is a little more history. We've got the letters of Paul. We've got the Apocalypse and the apocalyptic literature that is the book of Revelation. So it is a book, but it is a book of books, and it is a collection of all sorts of different writings that explain God's interaction with us in the world, explain the people of Israel, explain the Jesus and the coming of the church and its early formation. And so how did we get that? The Old Testament is a collection of writings that really spans a tremendous period of time of collection. Most often would be written separately, written in separate scrolls, and would have been written in Hebrew. We see this in the Masoretic Texts, in the Syriac Texts. We see this from some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There were the Hebrew. You could find some other languages like a little bit of Aramaic, but around that time, what you would also see is that coming from the Septuagint, a group of 70 scholars in Alexandria, Egypt, one of the centers of learning of that era, translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, which was the language of the empire, thanks to Alexander the Great for the way he brought the world, conquering and then bringing the world together. And then after it was superseded by the Romans, even though places would have their individual languages like Aramaic or like Latin for the Roman Empire, Greek was still the language that was used very, very widely. And so you had the Septuagint, which was the collection of that. And that was pretty well settled what the Hebrew canon was. The 39 books that we now call the Old Testament was settled pretty well by the Septuagint. You could make a case that really by the 1st century CE, that's Common Era, BCE before Common Era and CE Common Era have now kind of taken the place of BC and AD. But so Common Era, the 1st century, that was pretty well settled. And that's where we get our Hebrew Bible, which is the Old Testament for us, for Christians. There's also something called the Apocrypha, which we would say refers to that intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Some of our Protestant churches use that. It's still held widely in the Roman Catholic Church, Eastern Orthodox, the Church of England, I think still, or the Anglican Church, I should say, still use that. Some people do. We might spend another video and talk a little bit about that. But then when we get to the New Testament and its collection of writings, all of those were written in Greek. The Greek documents, Greek was the language that was used to communicate. And what's interesting about this was around this time we also saw a shift from what was at one point in time considered the proper documents, which were scrolls, to the formation of codexes, which was kind of like a notebook that you have leaves and sheets of documents, which is a lot more what we see today. But as time was going on, as the writers of the New Testament were living, so many were eyewitnesses to what Jesus did. So they had the Old Testament, and they had their eyewitness accounts of who Jesus was and what Jesus did. Well, as time went on, those people who were eyewitnesses and who knew that, they were starting to get older and pass away. So they recognized we need to start writing some of this stuff down so that the stories can continue. And so that's what they did. And around that time, at the end of the first century into the second, there was just writings all over the place. There were the letters of Paul, which are early attest to. The gospel started coming around, but then there was all sorts of other things that were coming around. Some that the church has recognized as very beneficial and historical, like something like the Didache, or something like the Shepherds of Hermes, that are really great documents that are good, but are they scripture? Are they inspired? Do they need to be included in the canon? And then you had other things that we know have like a little more of a Gnostic bent, like the Gospel of Thomas. And all of these different documents are coming around. And what people started to realize is, oh, we need to start figuring out what should be in the Bible. What should be the New Testament canon? And one of the early people to do this, but not in a really good way, was a guy named Marcion. And Marcion his father was a church leader. He wanted to be a church leader, and so he wanted a good, faithful text. But the problem with Marcion was he did not think that the Jewish Bible, and especially that Hebrew Jewish God, should have anything to do with the New Testament and Jesus. So what he did was he took 10 letters of Paul, and he took Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and he edited them to get some of that Old Testament stuff out of the way, and that was the Bible. And that, along with some other beliefs he has, got him soundly rejected. But people realized, well, we need to do something about this. We need to make a canon. And so that started happening. And what you see was the discussion more and more centered on the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That came together really, really early. The Acts and Paul's letters came together really, really early. They were pretty well agreed upon throughout the Christendom at that time, throughout where the church had been spread. Some of the letters took a little bit longer to figure out because they weren't necessarily sure who wrote them. They knew the era, but they weren't necessarily sure of who wrote them. How late was the letter from James? How late was the letter to the Hebrews? John's Revelation. Those took a little bit longer. But what we see is in the 3rd century, 200 to 300 BC, there started to be a pretty good consensus about what the canon should be. Folks like Origen and Eusebius were talking about this. I probably butchered those names. I apologize. Started listing what they were. But one concrete thing we can point to is on 367 CE, Athanasius, who would go on to be he was a bishop of Alexandria at the time, wrote a wonderful little book called On the Incarnation. I highly recommend taking a look like that. But he listed what we now understand are the 27 books in the canon of the New Testament, and it was officially recognized by the Council of Carthage in 397. But what you could say is that the canon really began to develop by consensus, and then has just been consistently affirmed year after year, century after century by the church. And that is how we got our canon. There are still wonderful books that didn't make the canon, like the Didache, like the Shepherd of Hermes, that give us a good insight to the early work of the church, but was not necessarily up to the level of Scripture. So that's a brief overview. I hope you held through all of the nerddom that just happened, and that you'll come back next week and we'll talk a little bit more about translations, because if you notice, we haven't said anything about the English Bible yet. We're going to get there next week. So I hope to see you next week. Don't forget to drop a comment or question. If there's something you heard that you'd like to hear a little bit more about, or if these raise other questions for you. Thanks for stopping by.